A restaurant magnate humiliates an elegant couple celebrating their anniversary, but when he discovers who they really are, it's already too late to undo what he's done. What happens when Richard Whitmore faces the devastating truth about his snap judgment? Before we go into details, click subscribe, like and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're listening from. Now, let's get into the story. Richard Whitmore stood near the entrance of his restaurant, observing the evening crowd with the same discerning eye he had perfected over 3 decades. The Meridian Club was more than just an upscale dining establishment, it was a monument to Richard's vision of excellence. Nestled on East 65th Street in one of Manhattan's most exclusive neighborhoods, the Meridian Club was renowned for its impeccable new American cuisine, flawless service, and an atmosphere that radiated understated power. Richard had built the restaurant's reputation brick by brick, and now it served as the preferred haven for New York's elite, venture capitalists, media executives, old money families, and political insiders all passed through its mahogany doors, drawn by the promise of discretion and a dining experience unmatched anywhere in the city. To Richard, maintaining the Meridian Club's image was everything. Every detail mattered, from the crisp white tablecloths pressed to knife-edge perfection to the seasonal orchid arrangements gracing each table. The soft illumination of crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow across the dining room, while a carefully curated playlist of classical piano provided an elegant backdrop. The restaurant was designed to embody exclusivity, and Richard took immense pride in ensuring that only a certain caliber of clientele walked through its doors. Richard himself was the very picture of refinement. At 58, with silver hair swept back from a distinguished face and wearing a bespoke charcoal suit from his Savile Row tailor, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had never questioned his authority. His features were aristocratic, his posture impeccable, and his manner always measured and controlled. His success was evident not merely in his appearance but in the way he moved through his domain, greeting guests by name, making subtle recommendations, orchestrating the evening's rhythm with invisible precision. He was proud of what he had achieved, and he believed that the Meridian Club's exclusivity was a direct reflection of his superior judgment. However, beneath that polished exterior lived a man who held deeply ingrained beliefs about who deserved a place in his establishment and who did not. Though Richard was far too sophisticated to display overt prejudice, those who knew him well understood his biases. He prided himself on his ability to make instantaneous assessments of people, judgments often rooted in their appearance, bearing, or background. To him, the Meridian Club was a sanctuary for people of refinement, and he was determined to preserve its character at any cost. This meant that certain individuals, those he deemed incompatible with the restaurant's image, were quietly but systematically discouraged from returning. That evening, as Richard stood surveying his domain with satisfaction, he noticed a couple approaching the entrance. They were impeccably dressed, the man in a tailored cream suit that spoke of custom Italian craftsmanship, the woman striking in a black blazer over a white silk blouse, her natural hair styled with elegant precision. Their attire was sophisticated, expensive, and entirely appropriate for the setting. But as they drew closer, Richard's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The couple, Andrew and Stacey McWilliams, were black. For just a moment, Richard's practiced smile faltered. It was a subtle reaction, one that would have escaped the notice of most observers, but to anyone who truly knew him, it was unmistakable, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the barely perceptible tension in his jaw. Andrew McWilliams was a distinguished figure with an understated confidence in his bearing. His skin was deep brown, his close-cropped hair perfectly groomed, and his movements carried the ease of someone accustomed to moving in circles of power. Beside him, Stacey walked with natural grace, her intelligent eyes taking in the restaurant's grandeur with quiet appreciation. They were a stunning pair, a portrait of success, sophistication, and quiet strength. But to Richard Whitmore, their race eclipsed everything else. In that instant, questions flooded his mind. Did they truly belong here? Would they understand the nuances of his establishment? Would their presence somehow diminish the carefully curated atmosphere he had spent decades perfecting? As Andrew and Stacey reached the entrance, Richard summoned his most polished professional demeanor and greeted them with practiced courtesy. "Good evening," he said, his tone smooth and practiced. "Do you have a reservation with us this evening?" "Yes, we do," Andrew replied with a warm smile. "Under the name McWilliams. Party of 2, 8 o'clock. Richard nodded, but internally his mind was already racing. He couldn't help wondering if their reservation was somehow a mistake, or if they had managed to slip through his hostess's screening process. He glanced toward Maria, his longtime hostess, who stood a few steps behind him, and gave the slightest gesture, a barely perceptible signal that she had learned to recognize over years of working together. It was a signal that meant one thing: this requires special handling. What Richard didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have imagined in that moment of reflexive judgment, was that his decision to handle Andrew and Stacey McWilliams would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately cost him everything he had built. The couple standing before him, waiting patiently for their table, held more power than Richard Whitmore had ever possessed. And they would remember every second of this evening. Richard Whitmore moved through the Meridian Club's dining room with the confidence of a maestro conducting a familiar symphony. It was 7:30 p.m. on October 14, 1995, and the evening crowd was arriving in their customary waves. He paused at the Vanderbilt table, exchanging pleasantries about their recent Southampton soiree, then moved smoothly to greet Harrison Pemberton, whose family had held accounts at the same Fifth Avenue bank for 4 generations. A media mogul from CBS waved from across the room, and Richard acknowledged him with a subtle nod that conveyed both recognition and discretion. This was Richard's domain, and he navigated it with the precision of a man who understood that a truly exceptional restaurant was far more than just excellent food and impeccable service. It was about curation. It was about creating an atmosphere where New York's elite could gather among their own kind, insulated from the chaos and mediocrity of the outside world. He had long believed that great restaurants must serve as gatekeepers, carefully controlling who gained entry to their sanctuaries. Any establishment that threw open its doors to just anyone, Richard often thought, would inevitably descend into ordinariness. His philosophy hadn't formed overnight. Richard had grown up in Brooklyn, the son of a restaurant family that ran a modest Italian trattoria in Bensonhurst. His father had worked 16-hour days serving red sauce and calamari to neighborhood regulars, and young Richard had watched him age prematurely from the stress and physical demands. His mother had handled the books, her fingers perpetually stained with ink, her face lined with worry over bills and supplies. They had been good people, hard-working people, but Richard had recognized early on that hard work alone wasn't enough. What mattered was positioning, presentation, and access to the right circles. He had left Brooklyn at 18 with a burning determination to transcend his origins. After culinary school and apprenticeships at several Manhattan establishments, Richard had saved every penny until he could open his first restaurant at 28. It had been modest, but strategically located and meticulously executed. Within 5 years, he owned a second establishment. Within 15, a third. The Meridian Club, opened 7 years ago, was his crowning achievement, the culmination of everything he had learned about what wealthy New Yorkers truly valued: exclusivity, discretion, and the unspoken assurance that they would never have to dine alongside anyone they might consider beneath them. Richard prided himself on his ability to assess people instantly. He could read wealth in the cut of a suit, breeding in a person's posture, belonging in the subtle confidence of their demeanor. This gift, he believed, was what separated him from ordinary restaurateurs. He didn't simply serve meals, he curated experiences, and that required knowing precisely who belonged in his establishment and who did not. As he returned to his position near the entrance, surveying his kingdom with satisfaction, Richard had no way of knowing that his most trusted instinct, his certainty that he could judge who belonged with a single glance, was about to become his greatest liability. Andrew and Stacey McWilliams arrived at precisely 8 o'clock, moving through the entrance with the unhurried grace of people accustomed to fine establishments. Andrew held the door for his wife, his hand briefly touching the small of her back as they stepped into the warmth and golden light of the Meridian Club. It was their 15th wedding anniversary, and they had chosen this restaurant specifically for its reputation, the kind of place where a milestone deserved to be celebrated. Maria, the hostess, greeted them with her practiced smile. "Good evening. Welcome to the Meridian Club." "Good evening," Andrew replied warmly. "We have a reservation. McWilliams, party of 2. Maria's fingers moved across her reservation book, finding their name immediately. Yes, Mr. McWilliams. Right this way, please. But before she could gather the menus, Richard appeared at her side. He had been watching from his usual position near the bar, and something in his posture had shifted the moment the couple entered. Maria recognized that shift. She had worked for Richard long enough to understand his silent signals, though she had never been entirely comfortable with what they implied. "I'll handle this, Maria," Richard said quietly, his tone leaving no room for discussion. He turned to the couple with his most polished smile, the one he reserved for situations requiring delicate management. "Good evening. I'm Richard Whitmore, the owner. Welcome to the Meridian Club." "Thank you," Stacy said, her voice warm with genuine pleasure. "We've heard wonderful things about your restaurant." "How kind," Richard replied, but even as the words left his mouth, his mind was racing through calculations that had nothing to do with hospitality. He looked at Andrew's perfectly tailored cream suit, at Stacy's elegant attire, at the understated luxury of her jewelry, and none of it registered as it should have. Instead, his thoughts moved in a different direction entirely. This could be complicated, he thought. The atmosphere here is very particular. Very refined. Would they truly be comfortable? Would our regular guests be comfortable? He told himself these were legitimate concerns about maintaining the restaurant's carefully cultivated ambience. He assured himself that this wasn't about prejudice, it was about fit, about preserving the delicate social ecosystem that made the Meridian Club what it was. The Vanderbilts and the Pembertons came here because they expected a certain environment, a certain type of company. Introducing elements that might disturb that balance, that might make his established clientele question their choice of venue, was simply bad business. "I've built this place on understanding what people want," Richard reasoned. "On creating a space where they feel among their own kind. That's not discrimination, that's service." But beneath these rationalizations, something uglier stirred. A visceral discomfort he had never fully examined, inherited perhaps from his Brooklyn upbringing, from whispered conversations in his parents' restaurant, from a lifetime of unexamined assumptions about who belonged in spaces of power and privilege. "Mr. McWilliams," Richard said, his tone shifting to one of careful regret, "I'm afraid there may be a small issue with your reservation this evening." Andrew's expression remained pleasant, but something shifted in his eyes, a wariness that came from experience, from a lifetime of reading subtle signals that others might miss. "An issue?" he asked calmly. Richard had already decided how this would unfold. He would handle it personally, discreetly, and professionally. No scene, no unpleasantness. Just a quiet resolution that would preserve his establishment's character while avoiding any awkward confrontation. What he didn't realize was that his next words would set in motion consequences far beyond anything he could imagine. Table 12 was positioned in the far corner of the dining room, tucked behind a service station where servers gathered to organize trays and refill water pitchers. It was technically part of the main dining area, but only just close enough to the kitchen doors that the constant swing and soft thud of their movement created a rhythmic disturbance throughout any meal. The table itself was smaller than the others, with a view that consisted primarily of the ornate molding where the wall met the ceiling and the occasional glimpse of a server's back as they hurried past with laden trays. Richard had purchased table 12 specifically for moments like this. Every high-end restaurant, he believed, needed a tactical option, a table that wasn't quite objectionable enough to warrant complaint, but uncomfortable enough to discourage return visits from guests he'd rather not see again. "Maria, table 12 for the McWilliams party," Richard said quietly, his tone carefully neutral. Maria's hand hesitated over the reservation book. She had seated hundreds of guests at Richard's direction, but table 12 always left an uncomfortable weight in her chest. Still, she had a mortgage and a daughter in private school, and Richard Whitmore paid well. She nodded and gathered 2 menus. "Right this way, please," she said to Andrew and Stacy, her professional smile firmly in place. As they followed her across the dining room, Andrew and Stacy passed elegant tables positioned beneath crystal chandeliers, tables with pristine white linens and perfect sightlines to the restaurant's beautiful interior. They passed the Vanderbilt party, now laughing over champagne, and a table of bankers whose appetizers were already being presented with theatrical flourish. When Maria finally stopped at table 12, tucked away in its corner like an afterthought, Andrew and Stacy exchanged a glance that lasted only a fraction of a second. It was a look that contained volumes, recognition, weariness, and something else. A kind of resigned understanding that came from experiencing variations of this moment many times before. "Your server will be right with you," Maria said, placing the menus on the table before retreating quickly, as though distance might absolve her of complicity. Richard watched from his position near the bar, then moved to the service station near the kitchen, where Jeremy, one of his senior servers, was organizing wine glasses. "Table 12, Richard said casually, as though discussing nothing more significant than a minor scheduling adjustment. "No need to rush with them. We have several priority tables tonight that need your attention first." Jeremy followed Richard's gaze to the corner table, understanding immediately. He had worked at the Meridian Club for 3 years, long enough to recognize the subtext. He nodded without meeting Richard's eyes. 20 minutes passed before anyone brought water to table 12. Andrew and Stacy sat in patient silence, watching as servers glided past their table repeatedly, arms full of bread baskets and appetizers for other guests. 30 minutes elapsed before menus finally appeared, delivered by a junior server who mumbled an apology about being terribly busy tonight before vanishing again. Around them, the restaurant hummed with efficient luxury. A couple who had arrived 15 minutes after the McWilliams was already savoring oysters on the half-shell. The Pemberton table had moved on to their entrees. Laughter and the gentle clink of crystal created a symphony of privilege and comfort. At table 12, Andrew and Stacy waited, their anniversary celebration reduced to watching others be served. By 8:45 p.m., when a server finally approached to take their order, Andrew and Stacy had been seated for 40 minutes. They had watched 3 complete table turns in their section, guests arriving, dining, and departing while they remained marooned in their corner with nothing but water glasses that had been refilled exactly once. Richard observed them from across the room, his irritation growing in ways he couldn't fully articulate. They sat with quiet dignity, speaking to each other in low tones, occasionally glancing at the menu. They hadn't complained, hadn't made a scene, hadn't done anything to justify the treatment they were receiving. And somehow, that only unsettled him more. He made a decision and gestured to Bernard, his sommelier. Bernard was a tall, austere Frenchman in his early 60s who had worked in Michelin-starred establishments across Europe before joining the Meridian Club. His knowledge of wine was encyclopedic, his manner imperious, and his ability to make unprepared diners feel hopelessly out of their depth was legendary among the staff. Richard had seen Bernard reduce hedge fund managers to stammering uncertainty with a few pointed questions about their wine preferences. "Bernard," Richard said quietly, "table 12 will need assistance with their wine selection. Please give them your full attention." Bernard understood the subtext immediately. He had participated in this particular theater before. He approached table 12 with his leather-bound wine list and his most condescending smile. "Good evening," he said, his French accent thick and deliberate. "I understand you would like to select a wine this evening. Perhaps I might offer some guidance? Our list can be quite overwhelming for those unfamiliar with fine wines." Andrew looked up at him with calm, intelligent eyes. "That's very kind, thank you. We were considering the Burgundy selection. What would you recommend from the 89 or 90 vintages?" Bernard blinked, momentarily thrown off his script. "The 89 and 90 Burgundies? Well, they are quite different. The 89 was a warm year, you understand, with early harvest. Yes, which produced wines with more immediate fruit expression but perhaps less aging potential than the 90, Andrew continued smoothly. Though I've always found that the best 89s have wonderful balance despite the heat. The Côte de Nuit's producers managed the vintage particularly well." Stacy smiled, adding, "We visited Burgundy in 92. The winemakers were still discussing how those 2 consecutive vintages changed their approach to canopy management." Bernard's expression shifted from condescension to surprise, then to something approaching respect despite himself. You have visited the region?" "Several times," Andrew replied. "Though we're more familiar with Bordeaux. I notice you have the 89 Chateau Margaux. That was an exceptional year for the left bank, perfect growing conditions, optimal phenolic ripeness. I think we'll have that, please. Bernard glanced at the wine list, his finger finding the entry. Chateau Margaux 1989. $400. It was one of the most expensive bottles on the list, and Andrew had ordered it with the casual ease of someone for whom such prices were merely expected. An excellent choice, monsieur, Bernard said, his tone now genuinely deferential. I will decant it immediately. He returned to Richard's position near the bar, his expression troubled. Well? Richard asked. The gentleman is extremely knowledgeable about wine, Bernard reported. More knowledgeable than most of our guests, if I'm being honest. He ordered the 89 Margaux without hesitation. He discussed terroir and vintage characteristics like someone who has spent considerable time in wine country. Richard's jaw tightened. This wasn't how it was supposed to unfold. The script called for embarrassment, for exposed inadequacy, for confirmation of his assumptions. Instead, Andrew McWilliams had demonstrated a sophistication that exceeded that of most of Richard's regular clientele. Rather than prompting reflection, this revelation only deepened Richard's agitation. His carefully constructed narrative, the story he told himself about who belonged and who didn't, was being challenged, and he found himself resisting that challenge with increasing intensity. Just bring them their wine, Richard said tersely. And make sure their service remains appropriately paced. Bernard hesitated, sensing something deeply wrong in Richard's tone, but ultimately nodded and moved toward the wine cellar. At table 12, Andrew reached across the table and took Stacy's hand. Happy anniversary, he said quietly. She smiled, though her eyes held a sadness that 15 years of marriage had taught him to recognize. Happy anniversary, my love. By 9:15 p.m., the bottle of Chateau Margaux sat half-empty on table 12, a $400 wine accompanying nothing but the crushed remains of dinner rolls. An hour and 15 minutes had passed since Andrew and Stacy had been seated, yet no food had been ordered, much less prepared. Around them, the dining room continued its elegant ballet, servers delivering perfectly plated entrees, guests exclaiming over presentations, the subtle theater of fine dining unfolding for everyone except the couple in the corner. Stacy finally caught the eye of a passing waiter, a young man who had glanced nervously toward their table several times throughout the evening. Excuse me, she said, her voice perfectly polite, we placed our order quite some time ago. Could you check on its status? The waiter froze, his eyes darting toward the bar where Richard stood watching. I'll check with the kitchen, he stammered before retreating quickly. Richard had been waiting for this moment. He had orchestrated it, in fact, the delays, the neglect, the steady accumulation of small humiliations designed to encourage departure without direct confrontation. But now that the couple had spoken up, he would need to take a more active role. He straightened his tie, composed his expression into one of concerned professionalism, and walked deliberately toward table 12. Good evening, he said, his tone carrying the false warmth of practiced courtesy. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to check in personally. I hope everything has been satisfactory. Andrew looked up at him with eyes that had gone very still, very watchful. We've been waiting for over an hour, he said quietly. We ordered our meal 45 minutes ago. Richard tilted his head in a gesture of sympathetic concern. Yes, I understand, and I do apologize for the delay. However, I wonder if perhaps... He paused, as though searching for diplomatic phrasing. I wonder if perhaps the Meridian Club isn't quite the right fit for your needs this evening. The words hung in the air between them. Stacy's hand tightened around her wine glass. I'm not sure I understand, Andrew said, though his tone suggested he understood perfectly. Well, Richard continued, lowering his voice to sound reasonable, almost helpful, we're a very particular establishment. Our atmosphere, our service style, it caters to a very specific clientele. You might be more comfortable at one of the excellent restaurants downtown. More casual venues where... We're celebrating our anniversary, Stacy interrupted, her voice steady despite the anger Richard could now see in her eyes. We chose this restaurant specifically. We made a reservation. We've been waiting patiently for service that every other table has received without question. Richard's mask of courtesy began to slip. I'm simply trying to be helpful. And I feel I should mention, have you fully considered the pricing here? The Meridian Club is quite expensive, and I wouldn't want there to be any awkwardness when the check arrives. The implication was clear, insulting, and deliberate. Andrew set down his wine glass with careful control. I'd like to speak with the manager, he said. Richard drew himself up to his full height, his expression hardening into something cold and final. I am the owner, he said. And I'm asking you to leave. The declaration fell like a stone into still water. Several nearby tables had grown quiet, guests turning to observe the confrontation with barely disguised curiosity. Maria, the hostess, stood frozen near the entrance, her face pale. Bernard hovered near the wine cellar, his earlier respect for Andrew now translated into visible discomfort with what he was witnessing. You're asking us to leave? Andrew repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. Yes, Richard said, conviction replacing any pretense of politeness. This is my establishment, and I reserve the right to refuse service. I'm asking you to settle your wine bill and depart. Stacy stood slowly, her movements controlled but her hands trembling slightly. Andrew rose beside her, and for a moment, they simply looked at Richard Whitmore with an expression he would remember for the rest of his life, not anger, not even surprise, but a profound, weary disappointment. We'll leave, Andrew said quietly. But this isn't over. Richard watched them walk toward the exit, his heart pounding with adrenaline and something else he refused to name. He had protected his establishment, he told himself. He had maintained its standards. He had no idea what he had just set in motion. Andrew stood with deliberate slowness, the kind of controlled movement that suggested immense restraint. He stepped around the table and pulled out Stacy's chair, his hand steadying her elbow as she rose. The gesture was graceful, protective, and spoke of a partnership forged over 15 years of navigating moments exactly like this one. From his jacket pocket, Andrew withdrew a leather wallet and extracted a crisp $50 bill. He placed it carefully on the table beside the half-empty bottle of Chateau Margaux, smoothing it flat against the white linen. For the water, he said quietly, his words carrying across the now silent section of the dining room. And for the time. The bill sat there like an indictment, far more than necessary for what they'd consumed, yet a pointed acknowledgement of exactly how little they had been given despite their patience and courtesy. It was dignified, measured, and somehow more devastating than any angry gesture could have been. Stacy gathered her clutch purse, her movements composed despite the slight tremor in her hands. Together, they began walking toward the exit, their footsteps measured and unhurried. The dining room had grown conspicuously quiet. Conversations had ceased at nearby tables. Servers stood frozen in mid-motion, trays balanced in their hands, all pretense of activity suspended. Andrew and Stacy had nearly reached the entrance when Andrew stopped. He turned back, his eyes finding Richard across the expanse of the dining room. For a long moment, he simply looked at the restaurant owner, really looked at him, with an expression that seemed to see past the expensive suit and practiced refinement to something fundamental beneath. People always show you exactly who they are, Mr. Whitmore, Andrew said, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed space. Thank you for making yourself so clear tonight. I'll remember this evening. The words were spoken without anger, without threat, simply as a statement of fact. But something in Andrew's tone, a quiet certainty, an assurance that suggested resources and connections Richard couldn't yet imagine, sent an unexpected chill down Richard's spine. Then they were gone, disappearing through the mahogany doors into the October night, leaving behind a dining room full of witnesses and a restaurant owner standing rigid near table 12. Richard felt the flicker of unease in his chest, a brief moment of doubt that whispered perhaps he had miscalculated. But he dismissed it with practiced efficiency. He had been right to act. He had protected his establishment's character, maintained its standards. Whatever that man had implied with his parting words was surely just wounded pride seeking some small measure of dignity. Richard straightened his tie and turned to find several of his staff watching him with expressions ranging from discomfort to barely concealed disapproval. He ignored them and walked back toward the bar, where Harrison Pemberton caught his eye. "Good for you, Richard," Pemberton said with an approving nod, his voice low but carrying clear endorsement. "Can't let just anyone waltz in here. You've got to protect the brand." The words of validation from one of his most prestigious regulars helped settle Richard's nerves. He had made the right decision. He had done what was necessary. "Thank you, Harrison," Richard replied, managing a tight smile. "Just maintaining standards." He moved through the dining room, gradually restoring normalcy with his presence, encouraging conversations to resume, signaling servers to continue their work. Within 15 minutes, the Meridian Club had returned to its familiar rhythm, the gentle clink of silverware, the murmur of privileged conversation, the seamless orchestration of luxury service. Richard gathered his staff near the kitchen briefly, his tone brisk and businesslike. "We dodged a bullet tonight," he told them. "Not everyone is suited to our establishment, and it's better to address these situations early than to compromise our reputation. Let's move forward and focus on our actual guests." Maria said nothing, her eyes fixed on the floor. Bernard shifted uncomfortably. Jeremy, the senior server, nodded with an expression Richard chose to interpret as agreement rather than the resignation it actually conveyed. As the staff dispersed and service continued, Richard returned to his position near the entrance, surveying his domain with restored satisfaction. Table 12 had already been reset, the evidence of the evening's confrontation erased as though Andrew and Stacey McWilliams had never existed at all. The envelope arrived on November 2nd, delivered by private courier to the Meridian Club during the quiet afternoon hours between lunch and dinner service. It was made of heavy cream paper, the kind that announced importance before a single word was read, with Whitman and Ellis Investment Group embossed in elegant serif font across the top left corner. Richard opened it in his office, a compact but well-appointed space tucked behind the main dining room where he handled the business side of his empire. He extracted the letter with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to professional correspondence, expecting perhaps a corporate event inquiry or a partnership proposal. What he read made his breath catch. "Dear Mr. Whitmore, Whitman and Ellis Investment Group has been conducting a comprehensive review of premier dining establishments in Manhattan, and we are writing to express our serious interest in acquiring your restaurant portfolio, including the Meridian Club, Whitmore's on Madison, and the Greenwich Terrace. Based on our preliminary assessment, we are prepared to offer $47 million for the complete acquisition of all three properties, including real estate holdings, brand assets, proprietary recipes, and existing vendor relationships." Richard read the number 3 times, certain he must have misunderstood. $47 million. His own optimistic valuation had placed his portfolio somewhere in the 32 to 35 million range. This offer exceeded his most ambitious projections by more than 30%. He continued reading, his hands beginning to tremble slightly with excitement. "Our proposal includes a comprehensive management transition period during which you would serve as a brand consultant, ensuring continuity and preserving the exceptional standards you have established. We believe your vision and expertise are integral to these establishments' success, and we wish to honor that legacy appropriately. Additionally, we are prepared to offer generous terms for you personally, including performance bonuses, equity participation in the expanded restaurant group we envision, and a compensation package we believe you will find extremely attractive." The letter concluded with a request for a meeting to discuss terms, suggesting several dates in mid-November and providing contact information for James Whitman, managing partner. Richard set the letter down on his desk and leaned back in his chair, a smile spreading across his face. This was it. This was validation of everything he had built, confirmation that his methods, his exacting standards, his careful curation of clientele, his unwavering commitment to exclusivity had created something genuinely valuable. For 3 decades he had worked, climbing from his parents' Brooklyn trattoria to the pinnacle of Manhattan's dining scene. He had made difficult decisions, maintained firm boundaries, refused to compromise his vision even when others questioned his judgment. And now, finally, he was being rewarded on a scale that exceeded even his own ambitious expectations. He thought briefly of that evening weeks ago, the couple he had asked to leave. He had been right to trust his instincts, right to protect his establishment's character. This offer was proof. If Whitman and Ellis was willing to pay $47 million, it meant Richard had built something worth preserving exactly as it was. He reached for his phone and dialed the number on the letterhead. A professional receptionist answered on the second ring. Whitman and Ellis Investment Group. Yes, this is Richard Whitmore. I'm calling regarding the acquisition proposal I received today. I'd like to schedule a meeting with Mr. Whitman to discuss the terms. Of course, Mr. Whitmore. Mr. Whitman has been expecting your call. Would November 16th work for your schedule? That would be perfect. Richard hung up and sat in his office, awash in satisfaction. He never thought to ask who the actual investors behind Whitman and Ellis were. He never questioned why they had chosen this particular moment to make their approach. He simply accepted what appeared to be a spectacular stroke of good fortune, the universe finally recognizing his worth. Richard arrived at 125 Broad Street 15 minutes early, his best Bryony suit pressed to perfection, his leather portfolio containing financial documents and carefully prepared talking points for the negotiation ahead. Sullivan and Cromwell occupied the upper floors of a building that radiated power and old money, exactly the kind of environment where Richard felt most comfortable. He was here to discuss the sale of his life's work, and while he felt a natural pang of sentimentality, the $47 million figure made any sadness considerably more bearable. A receptionist escorted him through corridors lined with dark wood paneling and portraits of stern-faced senior partners from decades past. They arrived at a large conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a sweeping view of the East River, the water gleaming grey-blue in the November afternoon light. Richard stepped inside, his practiced smile already forming, and froze. At the head of the table sat Andrew McWilliams. Beside him sat Stacy McWilliams. The recognition was immediate and visceral. Richard's face drained of color, his carefully prepared confidence evaporating in an instant. Andrew wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, his bearing radiating the quiet authority of someone utterly comfortable in rooms like this. Stacy sat with her hands folded on the mahogany table, her expression neutral but her eyes missing nothing. Surrounding them were 6 other individuals, attorneys in expensive suits, financial advisors with open laptops, a court reporter positioned discreetly in the corner. Andrew rose smoothly, extending his hand across the table with impeccable courtesy. Mr. Whitmore, he said, his voice carrying the same calm professionalism it had held that evening at the Meridian Club. I don't believe we were properly introduced. I'm Andrew McWilliams, founding partner of McWilliams Capital. This is my wife, Stacy McWilliams, senior partner at Hendricks & Lowe. Please, have a seat. We'd like to discuss purchasing your restaurants. Richard remained standing, his mind reeling, trying to process what was happening. McWilliams Capital. He knew that name. Everyone in New York financial circles knew that name. One of the most successful private equity firms in the country, with a portfolio that included everything from tech startups to real estate developments to hospitality acquisitions. I don't understand, Richard managed. Please, sit down, Stacy said, her tone leaving no room for refusal. Richard sat, his legs suddenly unsteady. One of the attorneys, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, slid a bound document across the table. Mr. Whitmore, we're here to present a formal acquisition offer for your complete restaurant portfolio. The terms are as follows. She began reading with clinical precision. $47 million for full acquisition. A 15-year non-compete agreement barring Richard from any restaurant, hospitality, or food service venture anywhere in the United States. A comprehensive non-disparagement and confidentiality clause preventing him from discussing the terms of the sale or making any public statements about the transaction. His complete, immediate departure from all operational involvement in any of the 3 restaurants. These terms are non-negotiable, the attorney concluded. Richard's throat had gone dry. And if I refuse? Andrew reached into a folder and extracted several documents, laying them on the table with careful deliberation. Richard recognized the letterhead on the top page, Sullivan and Cromwell's litigation division. If you refuse, Andrew said quietly, we will pursue a civil rights lawsuit based on the events of October 14th. We have documentation of that evening, including video footage captured by another diner who found your behavior troubling enough to record. He slid a photograph across the table. It showed Richard standing at table 12, his body language aggressive, Andrew and Stacy clearly visible in their corner. The timestamp read 9:17 p.m. We also have sworn statements from multiple members of your staff, Stacy added, her voice steady and professional, including your hostess, your sommelier, and 2 servers who were deeply uncomfortable with what they witnessed and are prepared to testify about similar incidents involving other guests of color. Richard felt the room tilting. Richard signed the documents at 4:30 p.m., his signature appearing on page after page with mechanical precision. No one spoke except to indicate where he needed to initial, where he needed to date, where he needed to acknowledge terms he barely had the presence of mind to comprehend. When the last page was signed, Andrew and Stacy stood. No handshakes were offered. No pleasantries exchanged. They simply gathered their materials and departed, leaving Richard alone with the attorneys who efficiently collected the executed contracts and escorted him to the elevator. He walked through the financial district in a daze, the November wind cutting through his expensive suit as though it were made of paper. Around him, Wall Street bustled with its usual energy, traders rushing between buildings, messengers weaving through crowds, the relentless machinery of commerce grinding forward without pause. Richard clutched his leather portfolio containing copies of the documents that had just transferred away everything he had built, and felt utterly invisible. The Meridian Club reopened 6 months later under new management. The announcement in the New York Times praised the establishment's commitment to inclusive excellence and introduced Marcus Williams, a celebrated black executive chef whose innovative approach to new American cuisine had earned acclaim in Chicago and Los Angeles. The restaurant maintained its standard of culinary excellence while opening its doors to a broader range of distinguished guests. Critics raved. Reservations became even more difficult to secure than before. Richard's other 2 restaurants were quietly rebranded. Whitmore's on Madison became the Madison Room. The Greenwich Terrace underwent extensive renovation and emerged as Terrace and Company. Both thrived under new leadership, their reputations untainted by association with their former owner. Richard's name was erased with surgical precision. No farewell tributes appeared in industry publications. No retrospective celebrated his contributions to New York dining. Invitations to opening night ceased arriving. Calls from colleagues grew infrequent, then stopped entirely. The hospitality community, built on relationships and reputation, simply absorbed the quiet story of his departure and moved forward without him. He lived now in a spacious apartment overlooking Central Park, purchased with a fraction of his $47 million. The rest sat in investment accounts, generating returns that meant nothing. He had no restaurants to visit, no staff to manage, no domain to oversee. The non-compete agreement stretched before him like a prison sentence, 15 years barred from the only work that had ever given his life meaning. In the evenings, Richard stood at his windows watching the city lights, understanding too late the terrible arithmetic of his prejudice. He had spent his life deciding who deserved a seat at the table, making instantaneous judgments about worth and belonging based on nothing more than appearance. He had been so certain of his ability to assess people in seconds, so confident in his discriminating eye. Now he had no table at all. Just money, silence, and the bitter knowledge that the couple he had dismissed in seconds had dismantled his world with the same swift efficiency. 1 year to the day after that October evening, Andrew and Stacy McWilliams returned to the Meridian Club for their 16th anniversary. They were seated at the best table in the house, not table 12 in its forgotten corner, but a prime table beneath the central chandelier with a perfect view of the dining room's elegant expanse. Marcus Williams personally presented their first course, his smile genuine and warm. The service was impeccable, attentive without being intrusive. The wine, another exceptional Bordeaux, arrived promptly and was decanted with ceremony. As Andrew raised his glass to toast his wife, Stacy smiled across the table, her eyes reflecting the chandelier's golden light. To second chances, Andrew said quietly. To justice, Stacy replied. Their glasses touched with a delicate crystal chime, and they dined in the restaurant that had once refused them, now transformed into something better than Richard Whitmore had ever allowed it to be, a place where excellence welcomed everyone who appreciated it, where the only judgment that mattered was the quality of one's character, not the color of one's skin. Richard Whitmore never learned of their anniversary celebration. He wouldn't have been welcome even if he had. The end. Thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel. I put in a lot of time and effort crafting these heartfelt narratives, and your support truly means the world to me. Thank you for being a part of this journey.